Hi, I'm BJ, and this is the Arcane Alienist Podcast. Hey, everybody. Well, it's OSR October, October SR, October Pride Month. What, I don't, whatever you want to call it. This is a thing some of the anchor podcasters are doing. It's kind of a variation on RPG a Day, which happened in August. And it was more an opportunity to call for people to talk a little bit about old school gaming, the OSR movement, and some of the good and positive things about it. I think sometimes the OSR in certain areas and during certain conversations, certain circles online gets a bit of a bad rap due to perceptions of gatekeeping and basically just cranky old man behavior sometimes, which is not completely unfounded depending on where you go. There are some really great online communities that are involved with OSR and old school gaming. And then there are some places where people are a little more negative. I think the positive far outweighs the negative. It probably just depends on where you wind up in which groups. Where I see most of the negativity is not so much when you get into a place where people are just enthusiastic about, say, old school essentials or swords and wizardry or basic fantasy role playing or something like that. And more in those crossover spaces where there are kind of people, general D&D spaces where there are people who have, for whatever reason, they have an axe to grind with Wizards of the Coast or newer D&D, and so they hang out where there are people who enjoy 5e or Pathfinder or other games, and they just take every opportunity to take a pot shot at modern gaming and talk about why it sucks. And that's kind of what we're trying to get away from here. Is not an edition warring. It's just more, what are some of the good things about old school gaming? For myself, I think part of what I like so much about the BX and white box style gaming, which you'll find in Swords and Wizardry and then with Old School Essentials, which is right now kind of my game of choice for old school gaming, is I like just the clean, simple, efficient, fast way the game plays, particularly with a lot of the procedural rules. Those are the things that I think I'm drawn to it. You know, there's a procedure you go through to get through a round of combat and re-roll initiative. There's some just lined out. All the rules are kind of put forth for it's easy for the dungeon master to digest and keep the game going. So those are some of my things that sort of stand out to me. But I think if you certainly listen to some of the other anchor podcasters who are talking about this, and before I do that, I want to give big credit to Rob at Down in a Heap. This was his idea, but there are several people who were kind of doing this, including Rob at Down in a Heap, Jason, Nerds RPG Variety Cast, Taylor at Clerics Wear Ringmail. Who else is in there? The Redcaps Podcast. Kevin at the Redcaps Podcast is doing this. Pink Phantom Thoughts. I apologize, anybody who I may have forgotten or overlooked. Daniel, Bandit's Keep, obviously. And anybody I've forgotten, I apologize. So I don't plan to do a lot for this. I just wanted to, but one thought I had that kind of stuck out to me was the idea of rulings, not rules. And I think a lot of people will be talking about this as they talk about the OSR. That's sort of the rallying cry of why what's good about OSR gaming is rulings, not rules. The rules are simple, they're few. And there's a lot of undefined space in between them where it's just up to the dungeon master or the game master to make a decision. If you've got a good DM, they're going to be consistent. So the rulings may ultimately turn into a set of house rules where the DM says, well, there's not a written rule to address this situation, but here's how I do it, and that becomes sort of a standing house rule. For example, BX doesn't really speak to what happens when you fire into combat. There are lots of ways to if you take more the AD&D approach where there's a chance to hit an ally if you're firing into melee. I've kind of always ruled that if you've got a clear line of sight, I'm not going to worry about it. If you've got a clear line of sight on an enemy, no. But if you're trying to shoot over somebody's head or past a friend who's in a direct path from your position to your target's position, there may be some added difficulty involved. That's not in the rules, but it makes sense to me, and I do like a little more game where everything's not a gimme. You have to think tactically with your positioning, your moving, your timing. So I put that in there as a rulings, not rules. But I guess what I really wanted to get at with this episode was a lot of people, I think, fail to appreciate what the OSR contributes to, I don't know, all modern games, but particularly to 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people don't think about that. I think there's a large number of people who grew up playing TSR. I say a large number, at least in the conversations in the circles where I talk with people online and exchange ideas and thoughts. There seem to be a good number of people who grew up with TSR style D&D and then maybe dropped out of the hobby, they finished school or they had to start a job or for whatever reason. And then when 5th edition hit and was so popular, they're like, hey, I'm going to check this out again. And then they found, if you want to compare 5th edition to particularly something like Mold Bay Basic, 5th edition it seems like a very crunchy, very rules-laden system. And it's a crunchy system. It's not a rules-light system by any stretch of the imagination. However, if you live through 3rd and 4th edition, you will see that 5th edition is much more streamlined and has backed off from, particularly I think if you want to compare it to 3rd edition, where there's kind of almost like a rule for every corner case. 5th edition sort of scales back on that, and that was a choice. I was involved during the playtest era for D&D Next, and followed sort of the comments that we got primarily from Mike Merles, but occasionally from Jeremy Crawford as well, through social media and through their interviews and things like that, and feedback, how they processed feedback from the people who were doing the play test and how they explained their ideas behind what they were doing. But I know one of the things that Mike Merles had everyone do was internally at Wizards of the Coast, before they started the play test, they went back and played a little bit of every prior edition of D&D, from the old white box, Gygax and Arneson set, all the way up through every other iteration of D&D that has been published, to see what worked and didn't work and what it could inspire in how they approach their design for 5th edition D&D. At the same time, you had the OSR well established. It sort of began to take root even in the 3rd edition era, with people finding oh my gosh, 3rd edition is a well-designed game, but it is so crunchy. And Pathfinder, 1st edition Pathfinder, in a way, continues in that tradition. But you saw the OSR start to move out, and there's a really good interview on the Red Caps podcast earlier this month where Kevin talks with the person behind Basic Fantasy Role Playing and kind of the evolution of the OSR and how it started with an attempt to just continue to keep TSR style D&D alive. But go listen to that. It's a really good episode that he put out last week, I think. I'll put a link in the show notes. Anyway, but this idea of rulings, not rules, has sort of become maybe the rallying cry for the old school Renaissance, or the OSR, or whatever you want to call it. But that was also a constant theme and a constant phrase even used during the build up to in the early, the first couple of years of 5e after it was published, as rulings, not rules. Now clearly 5th edition is not as rules light and as I mentioned, as streamlined or as basic as, no pun intended, basic Mold Bay Basic D&D. But there was an attempt to capture some of that, get back to some of that. And I think it's really interesting, and I'll put a link to this as well, a Google Docs that Mike Merles had shared with everybody back. I can't remember when he shared this, if we were in D&D Next playtest, or if this was just kind of in the twilight of 4th edition, where he had some house rules he had done. He said, hey, we're playing The 1981 BX edition of D&D, and here's sort of the way we've adapted it to kind of blend some of the modern D&D rules that you'd find in 3rd or 4th edition. There was no 5th edition at the time. And it's an interesting look at. I'll put a link to it in the show description as well. But you kind of a neat window into what they were thinking. But again, something you would constantly hear from the design team for 5th edition D&D was also rulings, not rules. That we want to get away from these fiddly rules that have kind of defined 3rd and 4th edition to a certain extent, and obviously they weren't going to go back to 1970, early 1980 style original or basic D&D. They weren't going to do that. There were still a lot of people who enjoy some of the crunch of modern gaming. So I think they were trying to find something that could kind of maybe elements that would appeal to everybody. But yeah, so if you ran a lot of 3rd or 4th edition, a lot of Pathfinder, and then you look at 5th edition, there are places where there's no rule for stuff. And if you doubt me, find places online where 5th edition players and DMs are discussing how would you rule on this? How would you adjudicate this? How would you do that? It's almost as much as you would find in an old school gaming forum where there's not a clearly defined rule. Or there's a general kind of mechanic, task resolution mechanic with a D20 system, but there's a lot that the DM has to determine about how that plays out, and there's still a lot of rulings, not rules. And you used to be able to go on the Wizards Edition forum, but particularly with 3rd edition, and just get tons of feedback about how the game is supposed to work. People would ask designers, "How's this supposed to work?" and you would get kind of an official explanation of how to handle situations. And I think in 5th edition, you got much more of a people would tweet at or contact or speak to Mike Merles or Jeremy Crawford on social media, and they go, well, it's up to the DM. They wouldn't give a definitive answer. Occasionally they might say, well, this is how I might rule it if you're stuck, but it's up to the DM. There are multiple ways to do this. Always an emphasis on rulings, not rules, in any case where something isn't covered by the basic stuff lined out in the player's handbook. So I just wanted to make a quick, this is going to be a very short episode, but I did want to just throw that out there that in a lot of ways, and I remember this people saying this when they started saying rulings, not rules, and we got to see sort of how the rules kind of backed off in some of their complexity and then their fiddliness. Again, totally a matter of perspective. If you're trying to come in here from older 1980 style D&D, you may not see it, but if you're coming in from 3rd edition, 4th edition D&D, you would see it. The sort of backing off on a lot of the crunch and streamlining things and make it simpler. And then there's not a clearly defined rule. There's a recommended task resolution procedure, and let the DM apply it as they see fit and make a judgment call. If 3rd and maybe 4th edition were the age of sort of, I said this one time, sort of facetiously, player empowerment or player entitlement. I have all these options at my disposal to make all these to do all these things. I felt like 5th edition initially was at least much more of a return to DM empowerment with that rulings, not rules. Now the game has gotten more complicated over the last several years as they've released more options, but those are all mostly character building options. So players have lots of options to make different types of characters, but the basic once you have your character and you start running an adventure, there are numerous times where the DM has to say, oh, okay, well, how do we do that? Well, I'm going to make a ruling. Use this skill. Make this save. I find myself, having to tell people, oh, you don't have to roll for that. You just describe what you did, and this happens. But that's sort of my style, having a little bit of a foot in both worlds with kind of modern 5e D&D, but also old school D&D. So yeah, if a DM encourages, well, we're just going to work with what's on your character sheets and we're going to get deep in the rules, it may be very much like just playing 3rd edition again. But if the DM wants to run a game in 5th edition that is much more rulings over rules, and hey, let's not worry too much about every little detail, every little fiddly thing that's on your character sheet. Let's just describe what you want to do and we'll figure out what works. That works just as well in 5th edition as well. I think it's up to the table. But at the very least, it was a victory for the old school Renaissance that 5e at least took a few steps back in the direction of that simpler more open, more flexible style of gaming from maybe what had come before in the couple of editions of D&D prior to it. And as I get into what they're showing us in the play test so far for 1D&D, I don't see that going away. I think they're maybe going to retool a little bit of the mechanics for character classes and how you build a character and for how the monsters work mechanically, but I don't see that them undermining that same idea of, hey, here's a task resolution mechanic, and when you get into sort of there's still going to be lots of territory where the DM is going to have to make rulings over finding a specific rule for every specific corner case of something that a player might do to find themselves in a unique situation. Anyway, that's just my perspective. Thanks for listening. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Be sure and check out all those other podcasts that I mentioned, and check the show descriptions for those links I was talking about. And I'll drop another episode here coming up sometime in the near future. And I'm been a couple weeks. I'm trying to stay with a once a week schedule, but life keeps throwing me curveballs. Anyway, hope everybody's doing okay out there. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the Arcane Alienist podcast. The music you're hearing is Come and Get It by Scott Holmes Music. The cover art is by Dave Bone. Be sure to check out his stuff at ironseer.com. You can leave me a message through the Anchor website or through SpeakPipe. I have my SpeakPipe account linked to the show description. You can also send me an email at arcane.alienist@gmail.com. Just embed a voice memo, or I'll just read the text of your email during a future episode. Once again, thanks so much for listening.